Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for History 17B, Chapter 20, Politics in the Gilded Age. Next slide. There's an overview of the chapter. Next slide. The first heading is entitled Political Corruption in Postbellum America. Postbellum means after the Civil War. In the years following the Civil War, American politics were disjointed, corrupt, and at the federal level, largely ineffective in terms of addressing the challenges that Americans faced. Next slide. Local and regional politics and the bosses who ran the political machines dominated through systemic graft and bribery. Here's a cartoon that shows that issue. Next slide. Americans around the country recognized that solutions to the mounting problems they faced would not come from Washington, D.C., but from their local leaders. Next slide. Meanwhile, in the Compromise of 1877, an electoral commission declared Rutherford B. Hayes the winner of the contested presidential election in exchange for withdrawal of federal troops from the South. Next slide. As a result, Southern Democrats were able to reestablish control over their home governments, which would have a tremendous impact on the direction of Southern politics and the society in decades to come. And you can see in this cartoon that the Ku Klux Klan and former soldiers are going to create a system where African Americans in the South would suffer. Next slide. The next heading is entitled Key Political Issues, Patronage, Tariffs, and Gold. All told, from 1872 through 1892, Gilded Age politics were little more than political showmanship. Next slide. The political issues of the day, including the spoil system versus civil service reform, high tariffs versus low, and business regulation, all influence politicians more than the country at large. Next slide. The inefficiency of a patronage-driven federal government combined with a growing laissez-faire attitude among the American public made the passage of effective legislation difficult. Next slide. Some of President Harrison's policies, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, aimed to provide relief, but largely remained ineffective. Next slide. The next heading is entitled Farmers' Revolt in the Populist Era. Factors such as overproduction and high tariffs left the country's farmers in increasingly desperate straits, and the federal government's inability to address their concerns left them disillusioned and worried. Next slide. Uneven responses from state governments had many farmers seeking an alternative solution to their problems. Next slide. Taking note of the growth of the labor movement in industrial cities around the country, farmers began to organize into alliances similar to workers' unions. Next slide. Ultimately, the alliances were unable to initiate widespread change for their benefit. Next slide. Still, drawing from the cohesion of purpose, farmers sought to create change from the inside through politics. Next slide. They hoped the creation of the Populist Party in 1891 would lead to a president who put the people, and in particular the farmers, first. Next slide. As the economy worsened, more Americans suffered. As the federal government continued to offer few solutions, the populist movement began to grow. By the way, this is a new heading, social and labor unrests in the 1890s. Next slide. Populist groups approached the 1896 election anticipating that the mass of struggling Americans would support their movement for change. These are some of the issues that the Populist Party had, including a graduated income tax, secret ballot, initiative and referendum on the ballot, and so forth. Next slide. When the Democrats chose William Jennings Bryan as their candidate, however, they chose a politician who largely fit the mold of the populist platform, from his birthplace of Nebraska to his advocacy of the silver standard that most farmers desired. Next slide. Throwing their support behind Bryan as well, populists hoped to see a candidate in the White House who would embody populist goals, if not the party name. Next slide. When Bryant lost to William McKinley, the Populist Party lost much of its momentum. Next slide. As the country climbed out of the Depression, the interest in a third party faded away, although the reformist movement remained intact. Next slide. And those are the video lecture notes for Chapter 20.